I'm going to get started. Again, we have an amazing panel today. We're going to be talking about how to ethically and accurately report on children in a trauma-informed way today. I'm going to get started with our description. So children represent a fourth of the world's population, but are overrepresented among the world's refugees and especially among victims of conflict. Journalists like us play a critical role in shaping public perceptions and policy responses to children impacted by crisis and consequently their life outcomes. However, the unique needs of children are typically overlooked, oversimplified, or sensationalized in the news media. Reporting on children requires a knowledge of early brain science and development, and special trauma-informed reporting skills. Today, we're going to dive into exactly that, into what journalists need to know to ethically and accurately report on children in a trauma-informed way. So I'd like to start actually by introducing our moderator for this session, Irene Caselli. She is the lead on the Early Childhood Reporting Initiative at the Dart Center. She's a multimedia reporter and writer with over 15 years of experience in radio, TV, and print. And she's now focused on early childhood, reproductive rights, and carers. She has previously reported for the BBC, Washington Post, The Guardian, The New York Times, and others as a foreign correspondent in Latin America. Irene, I will let you take it from here. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm really excited that there's actually so much participation already, a lot of people trickling in. This is a very important topic, very close to my heart and to the hearts of the panelists that you'll be hearing from today. And this panel, as Devin was already saying, is part of also the efforts at the Early Childhood Journalism Initiative at the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, which is a project of Columbia University. And this initiative is possible thanks to the support of several international foundations. They are the Van Leer Foundation in the Netherlands, the Maria Cecilia Soto Vidigal Foundation in Brazil, and the To Lilis Fund in the US. And if you're joining us live, we'll have space for questions throughout, but especially at the end. So just add them to the Q&A section and we'll be reading them out. And I just want to give you a warning. We've been careful to choose visual content, but regardless, we're handling a topic that is delicate, and some of the images that we will discuss or show, but also some of the content that we will handle could be triggering. So please take a break if you need it, but also stick around if possible, because at the end we will also discuss how we can look after ourselves as journalists when we're dealing with such difficult and also heartbreaking content. Today's conversation is going to leave some questions open. It is important that we journalists create safe spaces to discuss our doubts. We won't have answers for everything, but hopefully we'll be able to provide some tips and guidelines to keep in mind so that you can feel more comfortable when you're covering tough situations in conflict and other crisis zones. And we're actually in great hands to do so. Let me introduce the two panelists we have today. Dr. Kate Porterfield is a consulting psychologist at the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma. She worked as a clinical psychologist at the Bellevue Program for Survivors of Torture for 20 years, where she provided clinical care and evaluation of adults, adolescents, and children who experienced war, refugee trauma, and torture. And she regularly consults on issues pertaining to trauma with journalists and human rights organizations and in legal cases. She's also a founding staff member of the Journalist Trauma Support Network, which is also an initiative of the Dart Center. And she's an incredible resource for all journalists, I can tell you from my personal experience. So welcome, Kate. And Hadil Arja is the founder of Tiny Hand, the winner of the Google News Initiative 2021, specializing in children's coverage in frontline areas. She serves as the lead editor of Frontline in Focus, which is also a recipient of the Google News Initiative 2021. With over 18 years of experience, Hadil has worked for prominent publications, including Huffington Post Arabic, but many others. She won the FJA Awards in 2023 and many other awards, also in investigative journalism. She was also a fellow of the Dart Center's Early Childhood Journalism Initiative this year, and most recently she launched the Children First Guidelines, both in Arabic and in English, with the support of the ICFJ, which is the reason why we're here. And for full disclosure, I also contributed to the guide, which is not the reason why I'm here, but it is a really useful resource. So Hadil, let's start by introducing your guide. Tell us why you decided to put it together and what it covers. Take it away and also show us some of it, please.
Thank you so much, Irena, for this introduction, and thank you for having me here with you today to talk about this very important topic, actually covering children's stories without violating their rights. So this guideline, the idea behind this guideline, which I have titled Children First, is to compile advice and tips from experts on how to tell these stories without violating children's rights and while taking in consideration all ethical, security, privacy, and all other important aspects while working on these topics. The thing that we are working actually in an area that has been marked by major events, earthquake here in Turkey and Syria, conflict in Sudan, flood in Libya, and most recently what is happening in Gaza. And all of these are very challenging when it comes to tell children's stories. And this is the importance of this guideline. So I have spoke with 7 experts coming from different backgrounds, academic backgrounds, photographic, journalistic, and humanitarian backgrounds. So first, let me share my screen to show you the guideline and walk you through the guideline to talk more about it. Okay. There. Can you see my screen? Okay, great. So this is the first page. Let's move to the first expert that I have talked with. And the first one was Toby Fraker. He is a communication advocacy expert at UNICEF. In this section, actually, Toby focused on 2 parts. The first one is the visual representation of children in conflict. And the second one, which is very, very important, the ethical considerations. So every journalist, before taking any action or working on any story, they should go through these ethical considerations, such as putting the child's safety and well-being first, listen to their views based on their age, maturity, and make sure not to cause them any harm. We should consult those familiar with the child's situation to evaluate the political, social, and cultural impacts of any images or reports. We should take great care with images of injured or distressed children because a powerful image needs to be in the right context to avoid misuse. So here he provides like 11 pieces of advice. After going through all these advices, and if the journalists still have doubt about a story or a video they want to work on, they can ask themselves this question. And in my opinion, it's very, very important question. Would I want my children or myself when I was a child to be portrayed in such a way? And this question, in my experience, it really helps me in a lot of insensitive stories. And it gave me, and after I published this story, I found that I took the right decision when I answered this question. So this is very important. The second section is by Jamal Saidi. And Jamal, he is the former chief photographer for over 30 years at Reuters. Here he defined the sensitive story. What is the sensitive story? And he defined it based in his experience, because he covered different war and conflict zones like in Lebanon, civil war in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and so on. And I want to mention something very important he talked about, that each war brings about new rules in media coverage. Wars differed in the shocks they leave behind, but what he learned was that images, videos, or reports that violate children's rights don't help stop wars, and this is very important. They only fuel hatred and animosity. So after defining the sensitivity story, we need to know how to tell this sensitive story. and this part by Khalil Ashawi, and he is the founder of Frontline in Focus. In this part, he gives very, very important tips on how to cover, for example, massacres, big events, what to show, what not to show, when to interview the child, when to stop interviewing it. Then we need to move to very also important part by you, Irena, when you gave us these tips about how to interview a child. And here I want to mention something very important before deciding if you are going to interview the child or not. You should know if you must interview the child. Before interviewing the child, sorry, see if you can get the information from an adult or other sources like court documents or social workers. But if you must interview the child, make sure to avoid causing them any harm, especially when talking about traumatic events, and make sure that the child is ready and willing to talk. Get permission from their caregivers. Then let's move to the second part by Maysoon Abu Khair. She's photojournalist documenting war zones for 20 years. And that's why I have chosen people that have this long experience. They were covering different parts of places around the world because they have this experience. They can give us something that sometimes we don't know how to cover or how to deal with these harsh events. So for Maysoon, because she has been covering war for 20 years, she talks about balancing sensitivity and objectivity and how important it is to amplify children's voices without exploitation. And this is photos by Maysoon. This is from Ukraine, her coverage in Ukraine conflict. Then Daisy Maher, she's the Middle East correspondent on AOS. She provides tips on telling children stories while ensuring their dignity in these 3 to 4 pages. And the last part, actually, by these few slides by Ammar Abdrabbo, and he's a photographer covering conflicts in Syria, Libya, Yemen, Iraq, and Lebanon. He discussed the impact of visual, especially in a time of social media when it's very easy to manipulate photos and videos. And this makes actually our mission very hard. We must ensure that every photo and every video is presented in the right context. And the last part here, you can find also other training or other good examples of stories you can read, and you can find the way how journalists found their ways to tell a sensitive story without violating anyone's rights or anyone's privacy. And also you can find a guideline by DART and the other one by UNICEF. And this guideline is available on tinyhand.net in both Arabic and English, and also on ITGNet in Arabic, I think, but it will be posted in English too. So this is a quick through this guideline. I'm gonna stop my screen now.
Thank you so much, Hadil, for making this fast. I know there's like a lot of content there, and there are a lot of elements that we'll come back to. I wanted to ask you, out of all this material that you put together and all these tips that you collected, is there something in particular that surprised you? You already mentioned that there's something that really stayed with you, with this idea of checking in with, would you have wanted your material from as a child in that context, that kind of empathic kind of exercise. You've already said that stayed with you, but is there something else that came up that surprised you as you were collecting these tips?
Actually, Irene, everyone I have spoke with gave me important ideas, important tips that they keep with me every time I work on a story. And maybe I would like to mention some of them. The advice about techniques, how they interview children. Every time we think that we know how we know how to interview them, but it is very challenging. It's based on their age, on their emotional state, and we need to hear from each other experience. And this I really learned a lot from. The other thing that I would like to mention, maybe it was by Toby Fricker when he said we need to avoid re-traumatizing children and families affected by conflict. Pressuring children to talk about their traumatic experiences in detail can hurt them again. Also, interviewing family members about their painful stories in front of children can affect both the adults and the children. And this is very, very important because sometimes as journalists, we took this decision not to interview the child and to take the whole story from their parents. But we need to make sure that this child in a safe place while working on this story, we don't want to expose this child to trauma again. And the thing that I also would like to mention, we are working in a very sensitive areas, crisis areas. Our mission and our coverage shouldn't make children lives harder. It's already very hard and it's already very difficult. We need to make sure, and we need to take all of this before working on any story. So yeah, I have learned a lot, and I found that these questions, it's not only my question, a lot of journalists like me have this question, and we need to start asking each other. We need to share this experience with each other to find the best way when it comes to cover this sensitive story, to make sure that it's a professional, it's not violating anyone's privacy or anyone's dignity, you know, anyone's right to.
Yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more, especially as you're mentioning, it's very important that we ask ourselves questions. And sometimes in our profession as journalists, we're always sort of running from one story to another, and it's very hard to stop and ask questions. And this is why webinars like this can be very important. But Kate, you have actually informed a lot of the things that I also put in Hadil's guide on how to interview children, and a lot of my thinking about what to consider, how to ask questions. Obviously, you have a lot of experience in talking to journalists about trauma-informed reporting. What are the doubts that you see that are most common, the elements that really journalists struggle with most, the questions that come up most, and what are your tips to sort of help them through them?
Yeah, so thank you so much. Just quickly, thanks IJNet for sponsoring this with DART. It's just such an important topic. I love seeing the attendance we have here. And just Hadil, I have to tell you, I think your guide is fantastic. I really do. It's so hands-on, it's so accessible, and it uses imagery. It's very meta, right? You're using imagery in this incredibly trauma-informed way that, you know, with the pictures you chose, and of course, the journalists who then spoke to you and advised you. So I just want to say thanks. I think this is a great addition to the field. And Irena, thank you so much for your work, continuing to think about children in journalism representation. You know, I think for me, the word that keeps popping up is trauma-informed, which is, I feel like, you know, Hadil, what you were doing here was creating a document that says being a journalist who tells stories involving hurt and suffering and violence means you need to think of trauma itself, that it is a force and it is a factor in the lived experience of these people, right? This is their life, and their life might be having moments that are terrifying, depriving, distressing, isolating. And so what you're saying is that's a factor, right? It's not just my story and my photograph and my recording. It's that these people have a factor in their life that is life altering, which is hurt and suffering. So I love that you made basically a trauma-informed, you know, guide for folks who care about telling the stories of children. My experience as a psychologist is that what you want to think about when you think about trauma is exactly what journalists tell us. And Irena, you asked, what do they worry about? And what journalists tell us is, I want to tell a true story, right? I want to really represent the world. I want to shine a light in a place that might be very dark with human cruelty, right? But how do I do it and not make those people who are living it suffer more or feel exploited or feel powerless? And so I think the answer to your question, Irena, is that journalists who are trauma-informed, like you all, grapple with how do I do both, right? Which is good storytelling that's truthful and not, you know, clouded over with trying to, you know, change the truth, but that also is respectful and caring. And that's the sweet spot, right? That's the place. For me, what that means are a couple points in this guide that you all hit really well, which are consent. I mean, consent is everything, right? And a child's consent is really different than an adult's consent. And you have to worry about consent with adults who've been traumatized, right? So because why? Because trauma is an experience of powerlessness, and it's an experience that affects the entire human organism. And so you want to be able to say to this person, I'd like to tell your story, I'd like to take your picture, but I want to just pause a minute and think with you about whether you would like to do that or whether there's any questions you have about that. So doing that with a child is trickier, right? Children don't have abstract thinking the way adults do. They can't measure, is the cost of this worth it to me, right? Children don't think things like, is this going to help the world? They don't. That's not really the way children think. So the consent question that you outline in the piece, I think in the guide, is really great, which has to do with always first starting with an adult if possible, but also trying to work with consent with the child and also think about the question of would this child want this picture in the world in 2 years, 10 years, 20 years? Would this parent want the picture in the world? And I think the example, I'm going to wrap up this piece in a minute, but I think the examples in the guide are perfect examples of this. You know, the little girl on the swing set, these photojournalists you've included are so brilliant and talented. I think a couple are on here today. What a thrill. That little girl on the swing set, there is incredible power in that photograph of that child and what she is dealing with in her environment without her being, I think, presented in an exploitational or disturbing way. The photo of the little girl with the backpack stepping into a destroyed building, also a dignified, careful representation of a child while still showing destruction, violence, the outcome of war. I could do all the pictures in your guide because I think they all are actual examples of what journalists grapple with when they try to tell a true story. So being trauma-informed means recognizing trauma as a force, and you have to factor it in. Consent is huge in terms of children. And later I'm going to say something about how what journalists also tell us is, what about me in here? How do I manage what I feel after I take that picture? And I can only imagine the photo that won the award by Mohammed Salem must, have evoked a lot of feelings, obviously, for all of us seeing it. And I can only imagine for that gifted photographer as well, what his reaction is. We'll talk about that later. So thank you.
Kate, can I come back to you just 1 second? I would love for you to unpack the idea of trauma-informed journalism in a minute, just for those who are attending, and I say a minute, it can be 2, but what I'm saying is that maybe there are people attending here that have not heard of trauma-informed journalism before, and this is so central to what we're talking about today, and you are the right person to ask. So please just, tell us a little bit more.
I mean, I think to me what it means, and I think what we do in our work at DART and what we love collaborating with folks like you all on, is the idea that the human experience of violence, of powerlessness, of being harmed, of living through a natural disaster, these human experiences leave an incredible imprint on people and on communities. And sometimes the word I use, and I'll share a quick image of this, is that this is what we call a bio-psycho-social, spiritual imprint that is left on humans who get hurt and who suffer. Irene, I think you're seeing the slide, yes. And so to me, and to those of us who do this work, recognizing that experiences of powerlessness affect the whole human, right? They affect the body. I'll talk about that in a little bit. They affect meaning making, what the person tells themselves, the way we're wired to tell ourselves a story. They affect people's ability to attach to each other and feel safe. And for many people, they affect beliefs, whether that's a religious or a faith belief or a larger existential human belief. And so trauma-informed journalism, I will wrap this idea up, says, I'm going to see how human pain and human violence and human cruelty affects all the parts of these people I'm covering, right? I'm going to notice that these folks may have been impacted in all these domains, their bodies, their sense of meaning, their sense of the world and each other, and their sense of a larger belief. And as I report on them, as I photograph them, as I think about them, I'm going to recognize that trauma was a force and it can't be ignored. I can't just barrel through, take the picture I want, ask the question I want, stick the microphone exactly in the moment that I want it. I'm going to think, no, trauma is here in this place, and it has to be carefully attended to. I think that's what I mean. And that's what we try to talk about at DART, which is that the biopsychosocial spiritual imprint of trauma must be recognized to do ethical journalism.
Thank you, Kate. And I think this is this sort of also gives us a great segue into starting to talk a little bit more about the visual perspective also. You were mentioning some of the pictures in Hadil's guide, and Hadil, a lot of your work is also very visual. You're from Syria, but have covered Syrian refugees a lot, but you're also now supporting your colleagues in Gaza in your coverage. And the current war in Gaza is particularly problematic, especially from a visual perspective. It's one of the most visual wars that we've faced in terms of how quickly the material is coming out and how terrible the impact has been on civilians. Do you have examples of difficult choices that colleagues have had to make and that maybe you've had to make in the past when it comes to sort of choosing a visual over another, not using one and picking one element over another?
Yeah, actually, Irina, I have been covering the war in Syria for like 13 years. We have developed our tools and our guidelines on how to tell refugee stories, children's stories there. But in Gaza's case is different, you know, because it's a place that there are because due to the constant violence and the daily impact on children, so it's very challenging, you know. So at the first beginning, when we start covering the story there were these red lines. We don't show children covered in blood. We don't film with children without their parents or adults, without their legal guardian, at least, you know. This our red lines when we cover the conflict in Gaza. You know, we were part of this daily frequent massacres, but we know we need to show what is happening there. So that was our red lines. But at the same times, I'm gonna give you this example about very sensitive story that we have worked on. Children survived without their parents, and now we are talking about like 17,000 children they survived without their parents. It is a big issue, and we need to talk about it. So when we filmed, we choose to talk with their aunts or their uncles, and in some cases we choose not to film with the child because of his and her age, because of his emotional state. And when we interview children, it was only general questions and only to show their situation. It is very challenging, you know, because this war, it's not like other war we covered. As Jamal, I think he mentioned this, every war comes with a new rules, and we need to develop ourselves, and we need to be prepared how to work on this. But there's these red lines. People, children covered in blood, injured, or even if we want to film them, they should be with their parents, and their parents, they should know that we are going to film this. I want also to give another example, and it's very sensitive example. We today, if you look through these media agencies, you will find a lot of pictures of children crying, and the description only the caption is only saying that little girls crying, and this is unfair. If you took this photo, you should write the full caption. You should give us the full story. We know that this photos leave strong emotions with the audience, and they react with it, and they will share it, but it's unprofessional at all to only post this photo of this little girl. We should give the whole story. We should respect them, because we don't want at some point someone come to us and say to us that we ruined their lives, we commit something bad, because as I mentioned before, their life is hard. We don't want to make their life harder. So working in Gaza is very challenging, and every time we seek advices from people like you, Irena, from Dr. Kate, because it's not only ourselves working there. We need to provide this story, and I know this will take time. And okay, give it the time that it's worth it, but after all, you will give this story that you will be proud of it as a journalist, and this story will leave an impact because we worked on it professionally without while considering all these elements, all these aspects, ethical, security. We don't want to put these children at risk after posting this story.
Thank you very much, Hadil, for the examples, which I think are very clear. And also, there is something that you're saying. You know, of course, you may have some guidelines, but as the situation evolves, you know, if a story becomes children that are left without parents or legal guardians, then how do you change your sort of ethical considerations, or how do you adapt them to be able to cover a story that is also so important, especially in a context like that, right? So this is very important. This is a very good example, for example, for you know, to talk about how fast changing also some of the contexts that we work on can be. Kate, you were just hearing now Hadil talk about sort of ethical considerations in the visual sort of realm. Is there, do you have tips, or do you have, you know, things that you would consider, or that you consider when you're looking at an image, and that you sort of tips that you give journalists that work visually?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I want to go back to that word again, biopsychosocial spiritual, which is all the human domains get affected when we see suffering, when we see violence, when we see something frightening, and of course, when we experience those things. So what is visual? It's a sensory experience, right? Your eyes take in data, right? And then you have to feel what your body's going to do in reaction to that. And these eyes are attached to our nervous system. They're part of the brain and the nervous system functioning. And when they see something frightening or grotesque or horrifying, guess what reacts? This wonderful body of ours that carries us around, right? So that body is going to react to the visual of a disturbing image. So then the question becomes, and a little later I'll talk about journalists taking care of themselves, but let's not do that for a minute. Let's think about the audience seeing this, right? Seeing these images. And of course, let's put most important, the subject, that little kid, or that mom or that dad. And so the question becomes, what is this visual image evoking in the reader or viewer? And what's it like to be now exposed and shown that way as that subject, right? And so what I ask journalists to do is pause and think about, what is the visual impact on you? You took the photo, or maybe you're writing the piece describing a moment. Maybe it's even a, you know, not a visual, but a description of something you saw. What's the reaction on you? Now start going back a little. What's the reaction on the listener, the viewer, the reader? And now the real one, what is the reaction? What is the impact on that subject? What will it mean to them to have been portrayed that way? Are they portrayed in a stereotyped way, in an objectified way? In a glorified way that's actually not quite, you know, right? Will they be able to, could you imagine them envisioning that picture in 20 years and saying, I'm proud that when we suffered what we did, I was represented this way, right? Could you even imagine that versus, oh my gosh, there is an image of me that is so horrifying. And these are hard questions, right? And I think that what you did, Hadil, with your guide was you didn't make it like there's a yes or no answer, right? There's not. But I promise you, if you pause and notice what is the impact of this image on me, the viewer or the photographer or whoever, it's going to start taking you down the road, right, to being able to analyze it. The trouble we get in is when we ignore, right? It's called trauma informed for a reason, because you're considering the trauma. When you ignore trauma, you just barrel through, right? I'm going to take a million pictures. I'm going to look at them all night long, lying in my bed tonight. You know, that's not thinking about what is your body feeling as these images hit you. So I love, you know, the word pause. I love the word notice, which is just notice a minute. What is this like for this human on the other side of it? And I think that's what Hadil did beautifully. if I could say one more visual thing about some of the images in the guide, I thought that the visuals by, I believe it was Jamal Saidi, of parents, I assume two parents in the two pictures you shared, really having agency in an incredibly traumatic situation. But both of those parents, the father, I think it's a father, but he's in a wheelchair and he is carrying his children in that wheelchair. To me, that was a really amazing example of showing something traumatic, but also there is dignity and agency in that subject. He is carrying his children in that wheelchair. I thought that was very beautiful and very powerful. I thought that also the mother picking up her child had a similar idea. And I don't know whether, I don't know what Mr. Saidi's, meanings that he attributes to those pictures are. He's obviously a very gifted photographer. But to me, that was an example of showing agency and power and not objectifying or stereotyping somebody with the visual image.
Thank you, Kate, for that. Hadil, I would love to, I would love to hear your thoughts actually about what Kate just mentioned, the pictures you picked, and maybe you can also share them again on the screen. That would be fantastic. I also would love for us to talk about another picture that has been sort of circulating a lot because it won the World Press Prize, but was also part of the Pulitzer Prize winning series in the breaking news photo category. And I'm talking about a photograph by Reuters Gaza photographer Mohammed Salem. And I personally really appreciate, I'll also ask you to share that in a second, Hadil, when you can. But I really appreciate how that photograph shows pain and horror really without being too visual. But I've also heard criticism that war is much bloodier than that, and that we cannot always sort of make it look tidy for viewers. So what do you make of this picture, first of all? And then I would love to go back also to the visuals in your guide.
Okay, so you can see it right now? Okay, so I have a question to all participants now. What makes a powerful photo? In my opinion, the powerful photo that I can show it to anyone without any kind of hesitation. And this photo is an example. I can show it to anyone while discussing the current situation in Gaza, and I can tell them what is happening there through this only one image. And I want to tell you this because I'm covering the massacres there. Capturing this image is very challenging because Mohammed Salem, he was surrounded by dead bodies, maybe in hospital, hearing all people screaming, looking for their beloved ones, but he documented that exact human moment for this woman. And I don't know if you know the story behind it. So for me, when I saw the photo, I was very touched. I felt very, my heart was broken. And I look at for the backstory. So this is not the mother. This woman is holding her niece. You know, there is a big story about it. So where's the mother? Where the parents? Her name is Sadi. She has a name. She is 5 years old. She was killed in Khan Yunis. So I collected all this information, and this photo, I can't easily forget it. Every time I saw it, I feel that I'm seeing it for the first time. And this is a powerful story because it tells a lot of what is happening there. And it's challenging to document these human interest stories and the photos in the middle of these massacres because blood is everywhere and people's dying, and everyone can document this. And we know today there are a lot of activists and organizations that are documenting what is happening there. But for us as a journalist, we need to be more careful while working on this kind of stories. So only, and while we share this photo and discussing it, it proves that it really it left that impact, and it is a very powerful story.
Thank you, Hadil. And yes, I agree that you've mentioned it several times throughout this webinar, and I think it's worth for us sort of mentioning it again. And it's similar to what Kate is mentioning about pausing and noticing. for maybe Mohammed Salem might have been easier to shoot other pictures, and he probably shot many other pictures, but noticing this moment that is human and is not gory, and putting that out there is probably much trickier than doing the other thing. And it requires, as you say, this sensitivity, but also this pause and a different eye, a different sense of dignity, to represent the people that are suffering. So I think this is incredibly important. Kate, I'm seeing you nodding.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it is, every time I look at it, yeah, it just holds me still in a place where I can pay attention to it, you know, which, and unfortunately, graphic and gory images, remember the visual, they tend to make us turn away, they do. And one of the human survival responses to something horrifying is we actually often go away, turn away, and want to shut it. Oh, you know, that's the defense. So in a kind of ironic way, something like this, which is so evocative of loss and grief, you can look at, right? And you can actually, you know, if you're lucky enough to have, you know, the ability to be looking at these pictures from your safe place where you live, you can think, my God, this is going on, right? But I think some images, they're so horrific that it actually makes people turn away, and maybe makes, you know, the world turn away. So it is so powerful to be able to show loss and show human suffering in a way that people can tolerate paying attention to. I think it's a real gift.
Yes, I want to just remind the attendees that you can ask questions. I know a couple of questions have trickled in, but please feel free to type them away or to let us know. We'll be very happy to answer them. I just, one is coming up, so I will read that in a second. But I want us to talk a little bit now about this element of what it means to create images, but also to portray through words and through imprint stories of children in incredibly vulnerable situations that then have a life of their own. The internet now is, you know, is not controllable. Years ago, you know, 20 years ago, when you were a foreign correspondent, you could say, hi, I'm writing this story for foreign media. It's going to be in another language. It's unlikely it will be seen in your country. But that obviously is not a possibility anymore. So what, you mentioned this a little bit before, Hadil, but what are the elements to consider when we want to also think about the dignity and think forward? You know, what will this image mean in 20 years, or what will it mean that this person's name on the internet is attached to a vulnerable moment, or a moment that may be embarrassing for them later, or that they may want to not remember anymore? What can we do, Hadil and Kate, to consider this, considering that in the end we're still trying to do our journalism to show the world what's happening and to get, you know, these stories out?
So first of all, we should have high standards, raise our standards while working on any story. In my opinion, each story, it has its own uniqueness. You know, we should talk more before working on any story related to children. And my red lines, and I believe they should stay as red lines, that we shouldn't post photos of children talking about experiences of being raped or sexually harassed, or of children being recruited, because these can put them at risk of societal stigma or security dangers. These are red lines. We shouldn't cross them. So, and we should, as I mentioned, raise our standards. I know, Irena, you may talk about this, the girl in the picture, the girl that she was survived by the napalm.
The Vietnam story, the so-called
Vietnam
napalm
story,
girl.
exactly.
Yes, feel free to mention it, Hadil.
Exactly. And I have been thinking about this photo actually a lot. And I was asking myself, if I was on the photographer place. Am I going to post this photo? I'm not sure. But after reading how this girl became a strong woman with a strong, inspiring message, and she has this strong foundation, she has this work she's fighting for. I think, yeah, she was lucky enough, and maybe I'm gonna post this photo if I knew that she will be like this, you know. So each case we need to take it as its own case. We can't install it or take it as general rules, you know, because if other girls they might not survive that situation, and that this photo might hurt her. Maybe this girl, she was lucky enough because she has the right people to support her. She had this strong personality, and she overcome all these circumstances, you know. So it's very challenging. We need to keep talking and discussing this. And for me, specializing in children journalism, it's very important because, you know, maybe in our region it's not that famous yet to be specialized only in the children journalism. But you, Irena, and Dr. Kat, you know how challenging is this work. Every story needs time to know how to be done, what to film, what not to film. And in my opinion, it's worth to give it that time. We need to give each story that time, even if it will take more 1 year or 2 years. Okay, but after all, we will be proud of what we are posting, what we are publishing.
Kate, do you want to add anything to that? And
mean,
otherwise, I can link it to a question that has just come in, which
Yeah, link it to a
please.
question. The only thing I'd say is I think Hadil's right. You want to try to prevent, you know, these kinds of conditions from being in place that make a kid ultimately then exploited or regretful that it's there. You want to try to prevent that. And the only way to prevent it, unfortunately, is with slow, careful consideration. Once something is out there that has been a problem for a human being and now it's on the internet, then we really are, there's so much limited, you know, recourse that we have. You can't scrub the internet. So to me, Hadil's exactly right. It's in the process. It's in the careful approach to people who are vulnerable, even if that is just a bomb has just gone off, right? Trying to think of that human who's living it.
Yeah, and we have a question from Humayun Babur. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, which is, you know, about how media outlets may follow their own publication ethics, and then guides like Children's First can you know, help. But how do we control social media storms, given that anyone with a smartphone can publish any photo? How would you address this issue? Anyone?
We
Hadil?
can control it, but as a journalist, professional journalist, we can provide high quality content, respecting our ethical guidelines, respecting all people that we interviewed. This is our mission. We can never ever control the social media, and I can admit that it affects on us negatively. But we keeping the good work. I think this will continue. You know, sometimes people they judged on Instagram and Meta on their politics. I know I have my own thoughts about them, but sometimes, yeah, it's right to be restricted, not to publish all this blood easily on the Instagram or Facebook. So this is our mission. We should keep our standards, even if the social media is open to publish anything, because we are journalists. We are not social media writers, content creators.
Yes, thank you for that. We have another question by Babis Kaloyanis, which asks about children, but people in general in refugee facilities. What are the elements to consider? Kate, do you want to maybe mention some of it, given all the experience you've had over the years?
Well, yeah, though I would defer really to Hadil on this and to you, Irena, just because, you know, I've mostly been in the United States with folks who are now here. And with, though I have some experience with border issues and also some folks coming out of refugee or IDP camps, I would just want to caution, I don't feel an expert on this. What I'll say is anyone who is in any kind of camp or, you know, even a detention center, obviously, which becomes even more restrictive and less power and control, I would be very, very carefully considering how you can get consent that is as clear and as real as possible. Why? Because folks in camps do not have freedom of movement. They may have legal problems that could result from speaking publicly and could affect their migration opportunities and status. So I just want to be so careful with anyone who's living in transit, in migration or in detention, of course, and ask myself, is my question in any way jeopardizing this person's next step or their safety, beyond just their trauma history? That's my best answer on that. Real care.
Hadil, do you want to add something about sort of how to interview children and families in refugee facilities?
Actually, it's the same as I mentioned before, because we need to talk before with their parents, their caregivers. Then we need to know what information we need to get from this child. Can we get them from their parents? Are their age allow them to talk? Are they going to talk freely, or their parents will under pressure because their parents want them to tell something about maybe getting AIDS, or do you know these details? It's very challenging in refugee camp. So yeah, as Dr. Kate said, we need to take all this in consideration before working on any story. And I want to mention something else, because it is challenging to interview children in refugee camps, because those children, they saw only war, and it's very hard to get information from them. So letting them talking freely, you need to give them that space. You need to get their trust. So it is not easy when you see maybe 1 or 2 minutes from a child talking so freely. You should know that there are a big and huge efforts behind this 1 or 2 minutes to show you this story of this child.
Yes, I think this is incredibly important. What you're mentioning, it's there are issues around consent, but there are also issues around what kind of reality can they really sort of comment on, and how useful is that for us as reporters if we're trying to go beyond stereotypes and sort of typical representation of a refugee child. Are we just trying to get a child on camera crying, or are we trying to really portray their stories with dignity and really portray a story that is deeper? We have several questions. We have an interesting one, which is from Runyambo Gazinzira, Joseph, I hope pronouncing right, but it's about how is interviewing a child, when is it not bad to interview a child? It's an open question. I myself always say, I'm going to jump in for a second, and I'm going to say that I do not like to interview children, especially younger children, unless I know that I'll be able to spend some time with them, because I believe that you need to create some sort of rapport, and that if you're just in and out, I would find that very exploitative and hard to explain, especially to younger children. We can define what's younger, depends a lot on context, but that's my 2 cents. Kate, maybe.
I love that tip, because I was sitting here reading Mr. Runyambo Ganzinzira's question, thinking, oh man, it's right. Is there a point to be made that no, don't interview children? And Irena, what you just said helps us go, wait a minute, well, let's pause. Maybe the question is, okay, what are the conditions under which it would be okay to interview a vulnerable child, even a youngish child? And I think what you start to say is, number one, what kind of access do I have in terms of building rapport and spending time with this child, and repeatedly being able to say to the kid, hey, I want to remind you, my name's Irena. I'm a journalist. Do you know what a journalist is? Hey, let me show you my phone. See that? That's like a place where we put articles about your country, and we learn about it from kids like you. I would love to learn from you, but that's okay if you don't want to either. We could just sit here and like draw in the dirt here. I mean, you just have to take time. You have to show the child you are not some exploitative adult coming at them to get something from them. And you're absolutely right. It takes time and trauma-informed communication, which is showing the child you see them as someone who is totally free to say, nah, I'm good. I don't want to talk to you, lady. So to me, it's the conditions, but I think the question is fair. And I just want to say, if you are a journalist who says, I don't want to do interviews with children because it doesn't feel correct in my framing of ethics, I think that's actually a valid choice.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Absolutely, Kate. I do completely agree. It's hard sometimes to argue this kind of, to argue with editors about this, but I think it's something that is worth sort of arguing for. We're gonna do just one more question. I know that more are coming in, but there's a question regarding, the reactions for children's family. We have Juliet Justine Rukundo mentioning how some parents actually push their children forward, even if the children seem reluctant. But we have another question from Khaled Lekra saying, sometimes what do we do about the misunderstanding and bad reactions from children's families if we're trying to take a picture or a video? So how do we sort of operate with the families that are around children? How do we get them on board, and where do we, where are our red lines, as Hadil was saying?
Yeah, so it's very important actually, because as I mentioned before, in a refugee camp, maybe people, they have their own targets, and that's why they want their child to talk in front of camera. In this case, we should stop doing this report. We shouldn't film this kind of reports, and we should be clear with parents. We should tell them, we are going to interview your child because 1 or 2 or 3. And if they have their own targets, we should tell them we can't film this story, and we will stop working on this story, because we can look for another children, we can interview other children to talk about this case, specific case. And this is very important. And the other thing, that when parents try to give their children answers, it will be obvious actually, even for the audience. Even if you cut this off while editing, the audience is smart. They will get that this child is someone told him what, or told her what to say, so give them their freedom to talk. And if you find yourself in a place that you won't get this story, so stop and start from the beginning. It's worth, because after all, you will be, as I mentioned, proud of this story. We can't show audience stories that it's maybe acted, or children saying what their parents tell them to say. So stop, don't work on this story. Try to find other children to interview.
Can I say 30 seconds? Because that's a great answer. And just the bio is critical here. Sometimes that parent who's living in a war zone because of their own biological reactions may not actually in that moment be realizing or perceiving how vulnerable their child is in hearing this yet again. I've seen it a lot where parents from war zones have trouble seeing how much their kid is affected. So you want to be extra careful, I think, just as Hadil said, to make sure that child is not now doubly exposed by hearing their mom describe something, seeing her get distressed. It's really a great, great thing to do.
Yes, and we're coming to an end. I know that we need to wrap up soon, but I just want to mention something. All these issues that we're mentioning and the reporting that we do on these events has a heavy toll on us journalists, and we talk a lot about the secondary effects of trauma on journalists. And this is something that the Dart Center, we talk a lot about, and we don't have very much time. So Kate, this is going to be a difficult ask, but I would love for you to sort of tell us a little bit about what secondary trauma is, and what is your advice to both local and foreign journalists on how to look after themselves in this very heavy reporting context.
I will do a very short answer on that. And please go to the Dart Center website, dartcenter.org, and check out our tip sheets from great experts. But remember this, trauma affects all of us, right? And so if you move towards something frightening, something distressing, something gross and horrible in its imagery or in its sounds and its smells, you are going to be affected. You're a human. You're a biological being, bio, psycho, social, spiritual. You're going to feel it in your body. Your nervous system might react. You're going to make meaning of it. And you might even have a social or spiritual change in yourself from what you've seen, heard, or been through. That's secondary traumatic stress. Thank you for the people responding. Secondary traumatic stress is those of us who move towards something that is painful picking up that human response. Please be aware of it, read about it, pay attention to your body. Your body's going to tell you what you need. It's going to say, my stomach hurts, my head aches, I'm tired, I need water, I need to see my loved one, I need to pray. Your body's going to tell you. So try to listen to it and try to recognize that we, in the world of caring for and telling the stories of hurt people, we also need to be cared for and make sure that the hurt doesn't imprint us too much. And you have to be aware. So keep working on that issue. I'm glad you asked it, Irena.
Thank you so much, Kate and Hadil, and thank you everyone for these great questions. There are some that we didn't get to. There's a lot of material both on the Dart Center website, and IJNet was going to post about this webinar. Devin, I want to hand it over to you. Thank you so much for co-hosting this, and please let's talk more about the importance of reporting on children and doing it in a trauma-informed manner.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Irena. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Hadil. This was just an incredible session. I learned personally so much just from the past hour. Please go visit the dartcenter.org. Correct URL. Perfect. And we will also have a recap of this up on IJNet within a week. You'll be able to find recordings of this session also on LinkedIn and on YouTube within the coming days. So if you want to share this with someone, if you want to go back and review the recording and the advice here, we'll have the recordings up. Again, special thanks to the Dart Center for joining us today. And for just Hadil, Kate, Irene, just want to thank you once again for just this amazing session.
Thank you all so much. Be careful and be well, everybody.
We'll end it here. Thank you, everyone.